Valerie, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be here.
And I think the most obvious place for me to start is to ask you, what does the role of a sociolinguist involve?
That's quite the tongue twister as well. So you did a good job there. I am a linguist, a theoretical linguist by training, which means I study the underlying structure of languages. So the sounds that languages have, and so how they differ across different languages. For example, an R sound is very different. You have sort of the Scottish rolling R, but the American alveolar R, which is more of a tap. So that really makes a big difference socially because it says something about who you are, how you've learned to make that sound. So that's really the side of linguistics the sociolinguist looks at, how all those little things that we differ by in the way we speak or that we share say something about us, not just in terms of what we're trying to communicate, but also the identity we want to project or what we perceive from others. So if you come in as an American using this really strongly rolling R, it can either be cute because you're trying really hard to take on a characteristic of a place you're in, or it can be annoying because it feels like you're appropriating some aspect of identity. The reason we have those feelings is because of sociolinguistics.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And I learned when I was reading your book and doing some research for the show as well that your own background, both your parents were non-native English speakers. So I guess you've been interested in how language is perceived and the social kind of consequences of how you speak from a very young age.
I think that's what made it appealing. Now, obviously, I wasn't a 5-year-old walking around saying, I want to be a sociolinguist. I think it was probably a hairdresser or something more obvious at that point. But my parents are both French speaking natively. My father's Belgian and my mother's French Canadian, and they moved to the United States before I was born in first Madison, Wisconsin, but then when I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, which, especially not to age myself, but back in those days was very, very Southern. It didn't have a lot of foreigners for sure. It didn't even have that many Northerners at that time. So if you didn't have a Southern accent, you really stood out. And especially if you had a French accent, because you were basically the only people there with one, people always commented on it and noticed it. And so all my friends would come over and they'd make fun of the way my mom said my name. And I think they didn't mean anything by it. It was just like, oh, there's a cool way she says your name, because she used to call me Valerie. And so my friends would always imitate her, and it irked the crap out of me because it was constantly making me feel different. And so that's where I saw the power of language and the power of accent to really both make us feel a part of something and also separate from something. And I think that underlying feeling from a young age really followed me into college, which is where I took a linguistics course. And after I took that first linguistic course, I thought, my God, this answers everything. All these thoughts I've had, all these things that I differed from my boyfriend in thinking. And when he would say something, I'd think one thing, he'd say another. I realized that was all due to our training in language and how we use language differently depending on social characteristics. So whether I'm male or female, whether I'm black or white, whether I'm Southern or non-Southern, all of those things impact us both in the way we talk and the way we perceive other people.
I think it's funny to join the dots sometimes in what our interests and experiences are when we're younger and what we end up doing as our vocation or what we end up seeking mastery in. And if you look at what you've sought mastery in and developed mastery in, it's been that understanding of how on earth does what we say impact what those around us think. And you as a young child in particular, you want to be part of the tribe. You don't want to be in the out group. You want to fit in. And I think that's why you see when somebody learns the language for the first time. So if somebody moved from, say, France to the US at 3 years old and they hadn't really got a grasp of language at that point, they might grow up with a very American accent. Whereas somebody who moves at 12 years old, it's slightly less pronounced.
That's absolutely true. In fact, we have a lot of studies that show that, where we followed families that have moved to a different place with a different accent. And that can either be in the United States to a place with just a very different American accent, or taking an American or Canadian accent and transporting it somewhere where they have difference. And what we find is a staggering by age of the children. So children under 5 basically become native-like in their speech. So they pick up whatever their friends say in that new country. But if the older you get, the less able you are to pick up that completely native-like pattern. There are a lot of cognitive reasons for this, but there's also social reasons for this. And absolutely, it really does make a big difference when you're an adult and you relocate. It's sort of like the scarlet letter, but the A here is for accent, not adultery.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think sometimes people don't consider accents to be as much a part of language as they really are, because for me, they're fundamental in the same way like a Scottish English accent is very different from a Southern English accent or a Middle English accent, or like you say, a Southern US accent, or like a particular part of the US is radically different in terms of how the R is pronounced, or certain letters that get dropped from words in order for that to be like culturally related to that area of the world.
And it's so subtle, we don't even notice that what we're reacting to most of the time. And that's what's fascinating for me is we do these things without being aware we do them because we learn them so young. And then we perceive them and we have reactions to them often without even realizing what we're reacting to. So some things like people using like a lot, people notice that and it stands out and they can even say, oh, I hate it how people use like all the time. But other things, so for example, I grew up Southern, and so I do this thing where I drop T's after N's. So I say the word sentence, for example, as sentence, or internet will be internet, or plenty will be plenty. And I did that until I went away to school and other people would say something like, oh, you say that word so funny. They didn't really realize what they were picking up on, nor that it was a pattern. I didn't even realize I had it, but it did impact the way they thought about me. And so I've worked actually over my life. Because I was called out on it, I actually try to think about it before I say the word sentence, and I say sentence instead of sentence because it was something that people actually said. It made me sound dumb, which is a really sad way that we respond to people because there's nothing different about dropping that T than when I say I'm going to do it and I drop ing. Everybody drops things. Or if I say got it, no one says got it. All of us drop a T in that case, but somehow just because it's a different T than you would drop, you somehow think negatively of me. So I think what we need to understand is both we will all do things in our language that tell the world who we are, but we also need to be very sensitive to the fact that just because someone does something differently than you doesn't make them dumb or not competent or more fun than anybody else. It's simply just a matter of what we learn when we're children.
There's a lot of conceptions related to language, and I certainly noticed that in the UK we're a lot more focused on class than we are on race, which America's slightly more focused on or has been in the past. And I certainly notice it in Glasgow, where I'm from. Like, I would be considered to have quite a posh accent, and I actually got quite a lot of hassle at school for that for that reason. Whereas if I was a little bit more embrace slang and a little bit of a harder Glasgow accent, then it would almost have fitted in more so. And it's funny, it works in both directions, where if you're deemed to be speaking too properly versus to be like dropping more slang, you're maybe considered not as intelligent or not as thorough or not as aware. It's funny, it works in both directions, but particularly as you say, sometimes it can be discriminatory against somebody who, like you say, is maybe not using the correct English in the eyes of the person they're speaking to.
But I think you touch on something really important there. It works in both directions. So a lot of times overly formal or overly schooled language comes across as unfriendly, distant, remote, formal, and inappropriate in that way. And we judge people on that as well. And so, what we find in attitude studies when we do different accents and we see what people think of it we usually do it in a way that they're not really sure what they're being tested on. So we're not saying, here are two accents, tell me what you think. It's more subtle than that, the way we test it. But what we find is more standard, very sort of correct speech, so-called correct speech, tends to be deemed as unfriendly and unsociable and less fluid and less socially cognizant of how to get along with people, which can be detrimental as well in workplace settings, for example. Well, we look at non-standard accents are judged much more sociable, much more friendly, much more fun, but less intelligent, less competent, which can also then be a negative in certain contexts or a positive. And so I think you touched on something perfect there, especially with adolescents. If you have a posh accent as an adolescent, that doesn't necessarily make you cool, right? It might make you achieve a lot in terms of what teachers think of you, like you're going to do well. But a lot of your peers will tease you about it because it's not cool to have that kind of accent. And so that's sort of exactly what you experienced.
Of course. And I learned about this concept in your book of prescriptivism. And it was the first time I've ever come across something like this. And it kind of quite neatly explains what you're talking about there, that there's not this single correct way in how to speak, whereas prescriptivism would very much say that there is. It's a prescription of exactly how to express yourself.
Absolutely. So there's, really strong belief we have that there's a right way to speak. And in the UK, it tends to be a class-based distinction. And of course, there's, the Queen's English, or I guess it's the King's English now, that is sort of considered the model. But even if you look at studies of how, Queen Elizabeth's speech changed over time, there was actually a really fascinating study that looked at her Christmas speech over 50 years and found that she changed her speech over that 50 years quite substantively toward the common tongue. So away from this very prescriptivist notion, actually towards more casual, more everyday, more sort of commoner speech. So everybody actually adjusts in different ways over time, depending on what's sort of the norm at that era. But the really fascinating thing about prescriptivism is, though the idea of correct speech has been around for a long time, and we see the Greeks talk about it, the Greeks had a lot of belief in grammar. They were the first ones to come up with words like parts of speech, those kinds of things. And they definitely had attitudes about who spoke the right Greek and who didn't. But in English, which was considered a bastard tongue, right? English was just sort of the common people's tongue. It really never, until about the 16th, 17th century, was a language that you did anything worthwhile in. It was sort of the language of the street, the language of the peasants, but it wasn't the language of the upper class. It wasn't the language of the educated, right? So it really wasn't until the 18th century when all of a sudden people started saying, hey, you know what? We can make English our language. We can be proud of it. So there started to be this sort of pride, this interest as Britain grew in power. English grew in power. And then it started getting a literary history that was stronger. It started to get medical terms. It started to get scientific terms. A lot of those, of course, were borrowed from Latin and Greek or made up. Shakespeare actually makes a lot of fun of people making up Greek sounding words for English. And this was part of that era, starting really in the 16th century, where people started to say, oh, English isn't that bad. But it wasn't until the 18th century there were actually rules for English grammar. The very first grammar book that was written, which was written in the 1500s, was actually written about Latin. It was written in Latin as rules for what we should follow in English, if that makes any sense at all. And even Bishop Lowth, who wrote the first real grammar book that was used in schools, mainly after Lindley Murray took it and sold it. So he made all the money off of Bishop Lowth's book. He was using the grammar of Latin to teach his son the grammar of English. So most of those rules we have, like don't end a sentence with a preposition, don't dangle your modifiers, don't split your infinitives, those are actually rules of Latin that were transposed onto English. So this really weird idea we have about these rules that exist, they're actually quite arbitrary. And they're simply when we froze our ideas about language in the 18th century and said, oh, this is the way to do it. And the people they modeled that on were the rich people at the time, the people that had money, the aristocracy that had land. Those were the people's language who got written down as the rules. And that's what prescriptive grammar is. It's based on these wealthy people from the 18th century, not on any true, correct English from a cognitive or linguistic standpoint.
As you said, some rules have been frozen in time from that period, but lots of things have evolved. And I think it's amazing you give the example of Queen Elizabeth in terms of her speech over 50 years, almost modified a little bit to relate more to those that are listening and those that are engaged, because you said there that it can be almost seem like a little bit robotic and disengaged and antisocial to speak so properly and so to the letter that people almost feel like, oh, a bit isolated from how you're communicating and you don't understand me, you can't relate to me. So I find it fascinating that there are some things that have almost been set in stone, but there has been movement in other ways. How quickly does language move and change?
Well, in terms of getting into rule books, that takes a long time. So we do things in language for decades before a usage guide might say, okay, it's okay to do. I mean, they as a singular pronoun is a perfect example. We have used they as a singular pronoun since the time of Chaucer, but it only made it into the usage guides in, I think, 2010. So that took a few centuries to make it around. But in terms of language change, it often happens within one generation. So just think about your parents. You probably can point to things you say differently than your parents. And I'm sure more likely they can point to things you say that's different than them. And they've probably pointed that out to you several times, right? So within one generation, children change language. And really the young are where the root of language change is, the young and the female particularly. So language change happens really rapidly, but for us to notice it takes a lot longer sometimes. So things are very subtle. So I doubt Queen Elizabeth even knew that her vowels had changed. So the study looked at her vowels, and they moved more in the direction of the everyday people she was ruling over. But I think that also fits with this idea that over the last few decades, we've had this big move from being a more formal society where we wanted our leaders and our role models to be these things that were separate from us, these, sort of pillars that we wanted to look up to, but we didn't necessarily want to be like, to this pressure where we want people to be more like us. We want to see ourselves in our leaders. We want to see ourselves in those people that are celebrities or, kings and queens. And that has actually put a lot of pressure on language at the top to be more like language at the bottom. And I mean bottom simply by class or, sort of strata. And so we actually see a lot of convergence in that way. And I think if you look at the language that people use in their everyday lives in the workplace, you find that that's true. There's more casual speech in the workplace than there was 50 years ago. And that's probably what was driving this change in time in Queen Elizabeth's speech, is this pressure to relate to her people. And as the world changed around her, it was an unconscious desire to be more similar to those that she was ruling over. And I think we see that in a lot of cases. In fact, there was a really fascinating study of State of the Union addresses by presidents in the United States. And in the early 1900s, the presidents would say, I, right? I'm doing this and I've done that and I see this. But if we look after World War II, we see a lot more movement towards we will withstand and we will do this. Because again, you have this shift from wanting to have a president that's remote and different, smarter than you, and does this world stage, to someone that you want to see yourself. And I think if we look at presidential politics recently, we see that that's absolutely true. People are no longer holding up these ideas of, we want someone who's a statesman who's completely separate to us, to, I want to see myself in the person that's ruling. Whether that's good or bad is a different question, but that certainly seems to have been tracking with language as well.
It's become more populist. Yeah, I can certainly see that. And I think, as you say, if somebody can draw parallels between the conversations they have with their friends in the workplace or at the pub or the bar and the way that our elites are speaking, it's a little bit more relatable. Albeit I do think there's an element of, as you mentioned, there's still a level of association with correct grammar or perfect grammar with intelligence and ability to maybe lead the masses versus coming from within the masses.
I think you see different features that play the role of classifying people in ways that maybe others don't want to emulate in those contexts. And then the other things, like using like saying literally, non-literally, maybe rolling your R's a little less. Those kinds of things are more subtle, and they don't call out someone on a class or educational basis in the same way that certain things do. So, for example, one thing that's often stood out is glottalization of T's, which is simply a fancy word for saying your T's more like "ba," right? That's a huge class marker. And so and that, though, has actually increased. We find an increase in glottalization among different classes over the last couple of decades, but it traditionally has really signaled lower class speech. And I don't mean that in any negative way, simply that's the correlation of the speakers that tend to have more of that in their speech. And what's interesting is the United States has actually seen a big increase in young women using glottalization, but they use it in a slightly different context. So it's more like, what? The Kim Kardashian kind of like, what are you talking about? And it doesn't signal class. It really signals this certain kind of urban LA femininity. So it can mean different things in those contexts. But if you increase your glottalization in a workplace, like, said and got all the time, that actually probably would stand out and maybe not work well for you. But if you just did other slight shifts in your speech of things that weren't so salient as class markers, even though most of them actually probably started in lower class speech because that's the way language change happens, what we find is those gradually creep in till they become the norm rather than the exception. And that's what we're seeing a lot. So I think a really good example of that with being, I don't know if it's true in Scottish speech, but in American speech, we're starting to use got, the verb got, instead of have as a passive, right? So I've got I got fired, or instead of was fired. And we noticed that that started in lower class speech. So if we look back about 50 years, when we start to see it, we start to see it mainly in lower class speech, but it was very subtle. People didn't notice it. And what it seems to imply when you say, I got fired, I got hit, it's more, it's sort of, instead of was, it seems to indicate that it was a negative consequence on the person talking, on the person
It
that was
happened to
affected.
me.
That seems to be what that signaled, or at least started to. But by now, we actually see it in everybody's speech in America. It's really, really prevalent. And so here's a great example of no one says, oh my God, they're using got. People don't call it out. But if you watch how it has expanded over the last 50 years, it started mainly as a lower class speech feature that probably was trying to indicate something like I was a recipient of this in a big way more than was did. It kind of made more emphatic the effect. And then it was attractive because it had that extra nuance of meaning. So other people started using it, but you do this unconsciously. So by the time people even started getting it in their speech and it became widespread in everybody's speech, no one noticed it at all. And that's a good way of we're starting to talk more like, everyday people without even realizing we're doing that. So if you start saying God at work, no one's going to notice it. But we do find that that is a lower class innovation that has crept in our speech. And I don't know if you use got. Is that a feature?
Perhaps, yes. I think, as you say, it would indicate, or it would have an attachment to it of something happening to you in a way that you almost didn't expect. It's not like, oh, that happened. It's a case of that happened to me rather than by my
That's
own
exactly
volition.
right.
So I can completely see it from that perspective. And I think it's interesting you use the creep word because it has crept in. It's just it's become a thing rather than it consciously being integrated or pushed or driven by some sort of agenda. It's just the nature of language evolving that's become
Absolutely.
the case. And I find it interesting within your book, you talk about the difference between language evolving from a written perspective versus a spoken perspective. Spoken is maybe not the right term, but from a verbal perspective versus a written perspective. And I think it's clear, as you've explained in your work, that it almost happens quicker from a verbal perspective because there's still some rules and expectations around how we write that take a lot longer to break down or evolve.
Right, absolutely. Speaking is much more in the moment. It's much more in the moment and I can't even get that word. Immediate. It's much more in the moment and immediate. We're doing it in a context. We're not really spending that much time thinking about what we're going to say. It just comes out. And we have a lot of interaction with other people, and we tend to assimilate to other people's speech. So we pick up very subtly things that they're doing. Writing is a completely different thing, right? You're writing in your head. You're writing on a piece of paper, you're writing by yourself. It's a solitary thing. You might have an audience in mind, but they're not present. They're not having a direct impact on what you're doing at that moment, nor are they influencing the way they might influence the style you write in, whether it's casual or formal. But how they're talking doesn't impact your writing because they're not talking to you at that moment. So just from the process of doing it's different. But historically speaking, written language is not very old. I mean, the oldest written language we have is about 5,000 years old. And at that time, it was mainly used for trade or keeping track of amounts of money that were owed and things like that. It wasn't something that you did a lot. Whereas language has been around at least 50,000 years. So we have obviously been speaking a lot longer than we've been writing. And think about how much has changed in that 50,000 years about spoken language. We have gone from probably one language that started in Africa to thousands. I think there's about 6,000 languages today. And that's actually a small amount of languages. We peaked at about 10,000 languages. So you went from this one language to 10,000, things had to change quite a bit. And when we write things down, what we do is we start to preserve certain forms and features, and that kind of keeps them from changing. So when languages get literacy, when languages start to have a written documentation, that slows change down because people then start to believe the rules of writing should be the rules of speaking, even though it's actually the other way around. The rules of speaking are really what started the rules of writing. And writing simply preserves one moment in time, one belief about a system at that one moment when it was written down. But then we start thinking, oh, writing is way cooler than speaking. And look how intellectual these people are because they write. Since writing was sort of a skill of the wealthier, the more educated over history, and there we get this idea that writing somehow is better than spoken language, and that writing is true and pure spoken language, when actually it's the opposite. Spoken language is pure, it's true, it goes according to natural linguistic principles. Writing is pretty arbitrary. And the other good thing to think about in this way is, when you're a baby, you don't learn to write, but when you're a baby, you learn to speak. So obviously there's something primordial about speaking that doesn't exist for writing.
I find it interesting when I learn these things to look at my own behaviors, and I write more formally on certain platforms, LinkedIn, for example, where we got speaking. Some of my emails in my working career, that'll be more formal than what I put in an Instagram post, or sometimes in my cold outreach emails that are a little bit shorter, sharper, a little bit less formal. And the language that I use in some of those will differ radically in terms of how grammatically focused I am on it being down to the letter and nailed on, versus how keen I am to just convey a particular feeling or message and have an impact, which is more what I would consider that I do when I'm speaking almost all the time.
Oh, absolutely. We all work in something linguists call, with the fancy linguist lingo, stylistic repertoire. So what that means simply is that we have different ways of talking depending on the circumstance. And this is where we really are trained by our background to recognize the cues of one context versus another, for one to be formal, one to be informal, or the sort of where to operate on that continuum. And this is where we sometimes see people maybe miscued about the formality of a certain context. If you've ever been in a place where someone's either talking way too formally or way too informally for that context, it's because they have a different sense of what's appropriate there. And, maybe they came from a different background. A lot of times it's cross-cultural, but maybe they also just didn't exist in a place in their upbringing that had the same rules that the people in that other context did, for where it's appropriate to be super formal and where it's appropriate to be informal. And I think I hear a lot of authority sort of in workplaces say young people today don't understand the formality of those contexts. And that's a mismatch between age. So older speakers see workplaces much more formal than younger speakers. And that has affected speech. The problem is, a lot of times the people in power positions in those workplaces are older. And so their rules for speech, their rules for sort of this more formal style will be different than the young employees that they're hiring. And it can actually impact hiring decisions and also promotion decisions if the person that's making that decision has a different understanding of what's appropriate stylistically in terms of language in one context or another. So if they're worried about you going out on a sales call and being really too casual, they're probably not going to put you in that position. Now, what they're probably not recognizing is that half the people you'll be talking to on those sales calls will have the same idea about language as you. So that's where I think we need to kind of meet in the middle, where older speakers that might feel really like, young people today, they need to realize, well, all young people today, and they're going to be the next generation that you're selling to, or you're marketing with, or you're building a new platform with. And so you need to understand that that's okay as a style. So I think it's a little give and take.
Is one of the terms that I learned from you, is it age grading? Is it in terms of how our speech matures over time? Because I certainly, at the age of 31, my speech is more refined, albeit I felt I've always been quite a clear speaker, quite a good orator. I've definitely refined how I communicate. The podcast has helped with that, of course it has. But there's lots of other factors that are linked to that. For example, I, touch wood, swear an awful lot less now at 31 than I did when I was in my early 20s or my teens.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, you did a good job. You make great notes. Age grading, that's a good term to have picked up from my book. So kudos to you, first of all. Yes, age grading is a fascinating process that we go through as we age, where we use a different style as we get older that tends to be a little more formal, a little less flashy, and a lot less slangy. And so a lot of things like, obscenity is a good example, decrease as we get into the working world, because we recognize that when we become employees, when we become parents, when we become neighbors, in a community, the expectations on us in terms of the type of person we're going to be is different than when we were a teenager, and actually obscenity was cool, especially for boys. A good example of age grading is like use. So I know I think in Europe, we find different forms of like use also prevalent. It's become this global phenomenon, but in the United States, for sure, there's a lot of like going on, and a lot of speakers don't like it. And even in their own speech, they'll say, I hate how I use like all the time. Part of the reason is there's a lot of different kinds of like. I know, for example, in Irish English, like is very, very prominent at the ends of sentences. And that might be some of the roots of the like that we see in America, because it does seem to be in origin from that era. But what we find is, like actually serves some really good functions. And you can use those functions as an adult. But what happens is we find that 14 to 18-year-olds peaking in their use of that feature. So if you measure a 15-year-old and record them and analyze how many likes they use, it's going to blow your mind, right? You're going to think like, did they actually say something other than like? But you take that same 14 or 15-year-old, skip ahead 10 years, what we find is a case of age grading, where as they've gotten older, they still use like, but they use it in a lot less frequent cases. And so they probably have a 50% drop in the amount of like they use. That's not because it's not still useful, but because it's not socially as useful. And the social side of using like really peaks at 15. But the sort of linguistic advantages with using like stick around, but the social ones decrease. So when you're 25 and doing that, people don't like it. When you're 15, your peers think it's cool. So by the age of 25, you still use the ones that are useful. So for example, if I said, he's like 12, that's one that we see a lot of adults using. And that's where it's an approximator instead of about. And that sticks with people as they age. But when I would say something like, well, he's like, I don't know. And I was like, maybe, that one decreases over time. So we find that kind of age grading happen as you get older.
I find that so interesting because, as you say, like in that context is helpful. I was waiting like 20 minutes before the call started. Whereas when that younger person is maybe throwing in like constantly, it's so much harder to take them seriously. And I think that's one of the challenges that people come across if they use that within their speech too regularly.
I think it's really interesting, this idea of like being useless, because we have a lot of evidence that it's actually not useless. But what becomes, I think, felt as useless by other listeners is when you use it so often that it's a distractor. And I think what we find there is when you're 15 or 16, what's really important when you're engaging with other people is the perception of you they get as a cool person, as someone that fits in, as someone they want to be friends with, as someone that's sort of hip and urban, and kind of a little bit edgy. And like helps with that. So it's not so much that it means something in a semantic sense, but that it means something in a social sense. But that isn't so important when you're 25 or 30. What's more important is they actually think you're very intellectual and know what you're talking about. And so then we start to use like in a much more strategic manner for those kinds of meanings that I just described. And actually like has 3 different functions in addition to obviously being a verb, and something like swan-like, which would be adjectival. But in terms of using it as a discourse marker, you can use it as an approximator where you say he was like 12. You can also use it as a sort of particle in the middle of a sentence to kind of tell someone that you're summarizing, but you're not saying something exact. So you could say something such as, well, I don't really know if he's going to do that. Like, I think he probably will, but I'm not sure. And that what that indicates is that you're making a subjective announcement. That's really an announcer of subjectivity. Or you can use it as a quotative verb, which is where you use it instead of the verb to say. I was like, I'm not going to do that. And he was like, yes, you are. And what that indicates is, unlike to say, which suggests you're giving a verbatim quote. So if I said, John said he is going, then you take it as a listener, that's what he said. But if I said, John was like, yeah, I'll go, it doesn't mean he actually said that. That just means the sense you got was that he was planning to go. And he might have been like even shrugging and not actually saying something. So it actually serves a really good function in those ways. But think about if you use all 3 of them and you use them all at the same time, it's going to come across like all you're saying is like. And that's what we find the difference between an older speaker and a younger speaker is they reduce the amount they use, and they also tend to reduce the type they use over time.
Absolutely. Where do terms like and come from?
Oh, yes, those lovely filled pauses. So like is what we call a filler word, which means it doesn't necessarily have a definable meaning, but that it kind of says something about what a speaker's intending to say. So for example, I said it was an approximator. Filler words like and on the other hand, or in the British, in a more Scottish version, you had lovely different vowels, but those kinds of little particles that we stick in our speech when we're thinking about something, those are actually called filled pauses, and they're substantively different than things like and like, because what they do is they indicate that I'm thinking about something. They actually seem to be essentially a side effect of speech planning. So when I'm using a more abstract word or a more difficult word or a less common word, or when I'm just about to say a sentence because my brain is actually building the syntactic structure, instead of saying nothing, a lot of times we let out a or an which simply indicates, wait a second, I'm thinking. That's a little different than a like, which actually has more of a specific use in a sentence. Whereas this one is just like, hey, wait a minute, the wheels are churning up here. Don't give up on me. One of the benefits of that is that someone else knows you're still planning to talk, because if you just pause silently in the middle of a sentence, people tend to jump in on your turn. But if you say or everybody knows, well, that means I'm not done, I'm thinking. And so it really serves a really interesting function from both a speaking perspective as a help in my wheels churning, and also a listening perspective, because it tells you, back off, buddy, she's not done.
And that social cue also, as you said, indicates that somebody is thinking about what to say next. And for me, there's also some negative connotations to that. So, for example, if I listen to a podcaster and it's full of ehs and ums to an extent that I really notice it, I sometimes think they don't know their subject matter, or they're not well prepared, or they're not clear on their thought process. And sometimes that's allowed, because when we're having a high level conversation like this, of course, there should be some consideration to what might come next. And there'll be subjects that I talk about with somebody like yourself or another expert that I have on that I'm not the subject matter expert. So I should be able to pause and think and push back and take my time. But if I was ehing and umming all the time, I think it would make for a less convincing conversation, if that makes sense.
It does. And actually, you hit upon something really interesting there. When we look at studies of and a lot of people think it indicates that a speaker is nervous. When you listen to someone and a lot of times you get that sense like they must be nervous about what they're talking about. But in psychological testing that they did, where they looked at people with increased anxiety versus those without it, they did not find that and increased in more anxious contexts. So it doesn't necessarily correlate to anxiety or nervousness, but what it can do is indicate that someone is using it as a bit of a way to hedge while they're thinking stuff up, and they rely on it too much. So there are what we call heavy ummers and there are light ummers, and it does seem to be personality driven. So certain speakers use a lot of them. Some speakers use hardly any. And when we find someone who overuses them, like they're using them every word, it is distracting. And when we do studies on how much distraction it causes, what we find is the more interesting and engaging a speaker, the less listeners can tell you how many ums and uhs they use. So I think what you're getting at is sometimes we listen to speakers that are not that engaging. They may not be talking about something all that interesting. They may themselves be heavy ummers. And when you combine all that together, it sort of gives us a bad taste. The other thing is the context you're talking about, like a podcaster or someone giving a presentation. We have an expectation that they know what they're talking about. We have an expectation that they have practiced, that they have prepped for what they're doing. And so when someone uses and what that signals to us in those contexts is actually they haven't. They don't know what they're talking about. And so in a casual conversation, I think when people and we expect, well, we're having a casual conversation. They don't need to have prepped for this. And so it's okay and we don't notice it. But if I'm listening to someone give a presentation and they're umming and ahhing their way through it, I'm going to be a little pissed, because I'm thinking, did you not prepare? Did you not look at your slides? And in fact, as someone who's giving a presentation, if you prepare your slides and you actually rehearse it, you will use fewer ums and uhs naturally, because your brain has mapped it through. So when we do a study where we have someone describe a picture, then we have them re-describe that picture, guess what happens? They use less and in the second description. So if you read your presentation orally, like out loud, then that means the time you do it in front of people, you will use less and So it's really just simple practice and preparation that will decrease that. And so if I'm not thinking you're doing that because you're using a lot of them, that's going to tick me off.
I completely understand that. And every 10 episodes, I do a solo Q&A with questions from my email list and from my Instagram. And one of the common questions is, how are you so fluent in your speech? How are you able to go through an hour-long podcast where it's just me speaking sometimes without any ehs and ums? One, it's reps, as you say. I've done the practice. But to lift the lid, in my sales career, when I still lived at home with my parents, my mum used to say on some of my cold calls, she'd be like, I could hear you from the kitchen and you're ehing and umming. Are you nervous? As you said, like this is associated with nerves, or we consider it to be. But it was actually because I wasn't well enough practiced about what might come next or how I would handle objections that I maybe hadn't encountered before in my early days. And I really worked hard to breathe and pause rather than air and I think it's something that I've carried with me, because I feel that if I was on a sales call with somebody for the first time and I'm trying to convince them to take a Teams meeting with me or for me to come and see them, you want to instill confidence. You want to instill that you're assured to them. So cutting out the ehs and ums in that context was really, really helpful for me. And guess what? I've transferred it into this space, and 250 odd episodes into the show, of course, I've gotten better at it. But I find it interesting that you say those connotations of nerves and uncertainty are linked. And it makes for a better listening experience, and it makes for a better conversion experience in a sales call when you are slightly more fluid and a little bit less likely to pause or
Absolutely. I mean, all of those are contexts in which knowledge is power, right? In which seeming certain and sure helps you. And so and are the indicators of uncertainty. That's not a negative thing. I think that's the problem, is that being uncertain, thinking through stuff, that's actually good. I want someone to think through things. And also, we do find that when people use bigger words, more intellectual words, less frequent words, they and more, because those are sort of stored more deeply. You don't use them. You don't have access to them as quickly. So
you have time to unlock them. That makes total sense. And that's actually more relatable. That's more relatable as well. It makes us feel like that person's normal and one of us.
Right, exactly. And who doesn't want people to think hard before they talk to you? So it's not that we don't ever like them, but I think what we do is we translate that idea that we know they're linked with uncertainty to this context in which we want certainty, which is you're selling somebody something, or you're giving a presentation, or you're supposed to be a podcaster that's knowledgeable about what they're doing. And then we're like, well, I don't want you to be uncertain in that case. And so that's what really ticks us off about them. But they're not bad features on their own. In fact, here's a really interesting tidbit. When we look at studies of words that follow in an experiment. So if experimenters would say a bunch of different words and they'd use a in front of some of them and not in front of others, when you give people a pop quiz an hour later on which words they heard, guess which ones they remember better?
Because they came after the Oh, it's so fascinating.
So there is really some benefit to using them, but obviously that doesn't mean you want to pepper your presentation with in front of everything you want them to remember, because then it's going to have a negative side effect. But one thing I've noticed is you don't use a lot. I've actually done a bunch of podcasts, and some of the podcasters do a lot, and then they go back through and they take them out, right? Because that's the beauty of podcasting. You can go back and edit. In fact, there are some automatic editors, I think, that you can run through that will automatically
for everything nowadays, Valerie. I believe that.
So you actually don't use them. You don't even, everybody listening, I promise he hasn't really used any and uhs. There's no artificial intelligence being used here.
Something that I've noticed as a filler word for a lot of people is swear words. And particularly in younger people, where the F-bomb is every second or third word. What's going on there?
Well, there's a lot of power in profanity, especially when you're younger. And there have been studies that really do link profanity use with emotional release. So, we when we hit our head against something and we say the F-bomb, it's because that actually is helping us deal with the pain. And in fact, they found that when people put their hands in really, really cold water, like very, very unpleasantly cold water, and then they were told to cuss while it was happening, they were actually able to stand the cold longer than people that didn't cuss when they were doing it. So if you're saying bunny, 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 bunny versus fuck, 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 you're actually going to have to move your hand faster, right? So there clearly is an emotional release with cussing, but there's also a cool factor with cussing. So I think adolescence is a great combination of needing a lot of emotional release and needing a lot of cool factor. So you put one word that will solve both of them in the mouths of the young, and of course it's going to be popular because it hits both of them. An adolescent, you need both the cool factor and the emotional release, because that's pretty much what adolescence is. Who hasn't been a teenager needing both of those things? So fuck or damn or shit, those are perfect because they provide both the cool factor and the emotional release all in one pop. So that's, I think, why we see cussing so prevalent among younger speakers. Is it resonates more with them in their age group. It also is a time when you're really emotional and you need some ways of expressing that. And also you can get away with it. I mean, if I started saying the F-bomb at work all the time, well, actually I do use the F-bomb at work all the time, but that's because I'm a linguist. But in a sales call, if you started using it, it probably wouldn't go well for you because the cool factor is not so prevalent there. But when you're 15 or 16 and all your buddies are doing it and being cool is really the priority, everybody uses it. So I think it's just a way that young people can express a little bit of nonconformity because it's also something that parents don't like. And adolescence is really a time of separating from the adult world. And anything that helps you do that, and profanity is key among that because it's a little bit risque, really will be used at a high level.
It's funny you bring up separating from parents, because my dad used to say that swearing too often is a sign of an empty head and a poor vocabulary. And I actually agree with that to some extent, but it was an act of rebellion as well, as you say, to push back and be a little bit difficult. I also would believe that words carry weight. And if you use a word too often, like a swear word, it loses its impact. Whereas if you hear me say the F word, it's probably before something that means a little bit more, like my hands in freezing cold water, for example, or my soccer team or my football team has just conceded a goal that I'm not happy about. It's going to mean a little bit more. Whereas if I'm sprinkling it into every single sentence, it kind of becomes the standard and people don't take it as seriously.
Absolutely. I mean, anything you use so much just starts to lose its meaning, which is why we constantly invent new vocabulary for things because it just becomes boring over time. But I think for young people, it's not even that meaning of expressing something intense. It's more expressing this rebellious kind of emotionality that is really popular with young people. So just the reasons we do it and the needs it's meeting are very, very different. One really interesting aspect about profanity is it really started to get much more widespread in the United States after World War II. And it seems to have stemmed from soldiers being on the battlefield in such an intensely emotional, shocking context. And power words, these profane words, could really capture the deep despair and emotionality of the moment, so that's where we see an uptick in profanity. That soldiers on the battlefield in World War II started to really use profanity to express the emotion of the death and despair around them, and they brought it home with them. And so right after World War II, we see an increase in the use of profanity just in everyday speech. And then of course their wives started picking it up, and here we say F you in every sentence nowadays. So it's obviously gone pretty far in that number of years.
It's permeated the culture. And another thing that I learned a lot from you about was back channeling. And that's something that I do regularly while recording. If people watch this on YouTube rather than listening to it on Apple or Spotify, they'll see that I nod and I gesture and I move without saying yes, to encourage the area that you're expanding on, because that would make for one, a terrible listening experience. But I think it's so important that I back channel visually rather than verbally in these circumstances.
Right. And I think people probably see I'm doing it too. I'm a big nodder. Well, and when you do a lot of podcasts or things on broadcast context, you learn that if you back channel orally, it's going to disrupt what everybody's saying. So it is funny. Sometimes I almost have to swallow the because you just know you're not supposed to do it. But one of the things that we find is when you are talking to someone, we have accommodation happen. It's called speech accommodation theory, where we start to really change even the sounds we use. If we're from two different backgrounds, I bet from our first words of this conversation to the time we're done, if you measured my vowels and your vowels, they would subtly have moved towards each other, even though we have very different vowels, because we just do that naturally. We also find that people mimic words. So if you started asking me if I've ever had a pet bunny, instead of using the word rabbit, I would say, no, I've never had a pet bunny, even if I don't use the bunny in my normal speech, because again, that's accommodation.
We're
And we do
connecting,
that.
aren't we?
Yeah, we're connecting. And so a huge part of having a conversation is that connection. And a huge part of getting communication to be successful is making the other person feel like you want to know what they're saying, and also that you empathize or you agree. And one way we do that, we signal that, is by back channeling. So it's sort of listener encouragement, if you will, of whatever someone's saying. So nodding can do that, which means sort of continue. Or a lot of times we have the, wow, yeah, really? So cool. All that stuff, which obviously you can't do as a podcaster because it interrupts what you're listening to. But another thing we find is sometimes we have a difference in gender in terms of what's appropriate with that back channeling. So it's been, and I'm not sure it's so true now. The studies are 20, 30 years old on this, but they would look at the difference in male back channeling and female back channeling, and they'd find that men tended to use what we call delayed back channels, whereas women would use normal back channels. So when someone's talking to you and you're listening and you're like, yeah, okay, you can hear the difference in that from, wow, yeah, really. So one is delayed, meaning it's slower. It doesn't come quite on cue for whatever you were just saying. And what it indicates is sort of boredom and like, I don't want you to continue, versus the one that's right on cue and that sort of has a little more excitement in it is really encouraging. And so what they'd find is that men were doing these delayed back channels more than women, and women were doing the regular back channels, which then made women feel like they were not being listened to, and men felt like they were always being listened to. And so it was this sort of sense that women would have a lot of times in relationships where they just didn't feel like their partner was listening to them. And it seems to be a difference in what we've learned socially about back channeling. And I think that has changed over the years, but something so subtle as just this indicator you're giving someone to continue can really have an impact on even relationship health.
The flow of conversations, the feeling of connection, the feeling like you're being listened to, the feeling like you're being acknowledged and heard and have space. And I think that's one of the main complaints when relationships end. The female partner often says, my husband, my boyfriend wasn't listening to me, wasn't engaged with me. And maybe if he just learned to back channel effectively, there would have been a lot more ability for them to explore and have those conversations. In the time we've got left together, Valerie, I'm really keen to ask you about the evolution of speech and what impact we think social media is going to have on that, because some of the terms that I see coming into the language are primarily driven by short form content, in particular on things like TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts. What's going on there?
I think that's a great question, and one we're not sure of the answer yet because it's so new. New technology does have an impact on language, but more an impact in terms of spreading things rather than creating them. So, most linguistic innovation has to happen in particular context and particular social spaces where people have really, really sort of a relationship and interaction that's pure and organic. And that's a little different than what you get from social media, where it's just a picture sort of talking to you. So it's not the same kind of interaction as you get growing up. And also we're really formed through early childhood and adolescence. Whereas when you're doing TikTok or things like that, they tend to be older adolescents or young adults. So our system is somewhat set at that point. Where we find the biggest impact is vocabulary. I mean, the spread of vocabulary through social media is wildfire. I mean, it's crazy. I don't know if it's a term that hit you over there, but Riz, for example, have you heard of the term Riz? Like that just went through, and my children roll their eyes when I bring it up now because I have teenagers and they're both like, no one uses that anymore because it's so old school now. But it was something that started, I think it was on TikTok by a African-American influencer, and it just took off and became something, grandpa says. So it's really something that shows the speed at which and the depth socially at which words can spread on social media, on social media platforms. What doesn't tend to spread are more subtle things like sound changes, right? That people would pick up naturally in an environment as a child, because we need to be engaged and really attuned to speaking in a conversation as a child, listening and picking up the patterns, because you have to analyze it really carefully, statistically with the brain to understand it, which children are really able to do. You don't get that kind of input from social media. So I think what we'll find is a huge changing of the types of words that people use, and even maybe learning some languages that people wouldn't have spoken before, because you're looking at different kinds of content, and more American terms will come out, but also terms from other languages into English, because there's a universality to social media that there wasn't. We're exposed to more linguistically. But in terms of, are we going to have like a social media dialect grow up? Not at the level that we have everyday dialects in our speech. But for example, I think it's called TikTok Sorry, tic tac. The TikTok style of speaking. Yeah, exactly. Which is that vocal fry, that kind of creaky voice like this, like, oh, so cool. The slower tempo, that drop in pitch. That's actually a style that's been joked about being pervasive on social media. Those are things stylistically that others can pick up pretty easily. I think we're going to see this constant continual evolution of those kinds of styles that then blow through social media like crazy. How long they stick around is the bigger question, because things are so quick to come and go on social media.
We talk
So I
about
don't know that we know
15 minutes of fame. I think you have 15 seconds of
15
particular
seconds.
phrases.
If you can even be heard in the noise. I mean, that's the thing, right? It's really hard to get out there anymore. So I think it's a really open question for the future. Definitely, it has opened our horizons. It has made us more familiar with people elsewhere. And whether that might have a homogenizing effect on dialects, that's an open question.
I think it's going to be incredibly interesting to watch. And it's interesting, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that quite often women and lower socioeconomic groups lead the evolution of language. And you mentioned Riz, and that was from a black creator. A lot of the phrases that I see becoming popular, like no cap, that hits different, that's fire, slay, are typically from the black community versus like normal like white Americans that haven't maybe incorporated that into language previously. So to see that permeate the culture and spread really speaks to what you were talking about in terms of maybe other socioeconomic groups are leading this movement of English becoming slightly less formal or incorporating new words into our vocabulary that we didn't have before.
Absolutely. What we find is marginalized groups over time and across history have often led in massive changes to the structure of language. And we certainly see that. I mean, African American language is extremely powerful in America, in the American psyche, and on young American speech, particularly. But even if you look back in history, Southern English had a lot of influence from African languages that were brought over by enslaved peoples. And so the history of African American impact on language, especially in America, goes back several hundred years. But now it's very vocabulary oriented. A lot of times, because of social media, these words become more mainstream. And think about what's cool to you as a teenager. Is anything rebellious, nonconformist, slightly edgy? And to a lot of white teenagers, particularly white males, what African American culture, which is often a stereotype, not a reality, represents to them is danger and edginess and sort of counterculture. And that's why those terms are so attractive and they spread so much. I mean, you know, young white boy talk is just not as cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think TikTok nowadays is what rap was in the 90s or the 2000s, where maybe you would borrow phrases from Tupac or 50 Cent, whereas now it's from some guy that's picked up his phone and is talking on TikTok, and he's charismatic and he's exciting, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna talk like him.
Exactly. And I think there's an authenticity to it that is attractive. A lot of times, really casual speech or informal speech or slang or non-standard speech has this informal casualness to it that's very, very attractive. It feels authentic. It feels real, which is a lot of times why politicians pick up features of non-standard speech, because they are going for that authenticity, although it's very inauthentic, right? Tony Blair, I think, was accused of being, you know, very inauthentic in his speech and speaking Mockney sometimes. So, you know, I think the appeal of speech that's from these counterculture or non-standard areas tends to be that they are more real. They're a little bit edgy and they're authentic. And those kinds of qualities appeal across lines, whether it's socioeconomic lines or ethnic lines or age group lines. Those things are always very attractive.
Undoubtedly. Valerie, I've had so much fun recording this. I've learned so much from your work. Where should people head towards if they want to continue the conversation with you? And of course, get their hands on Like Literally Did as well.
Well, they should be able to buy that book wherever books are sold. So, you know, handy Amazon is really useful there, but also booksellers. But if you want to read more about my work or what I do for research, you can just head to my website, which is just valeriefriedland.com.
That'll be linked in the show notes. Thank you to you, Valerie, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.